let's say I was to be talking to somebody and saying, "Yeah, I know this guy, Matt Hansen. Yeah, he's 6'9", he's blonde, and he's 300 pounds." Okay. Now
We talking about the same Matt Hansen?
well, that's what the question becomes, right?
Yeah.
Like, and
I'm a heretic all along. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our podcast. Actually, your podcast, because you can be involved. Questions and almost answers. You can be involved by sending us questions if you're interested. But my name is Matt, and this is Greg, and we are the little pastor and the big pastor of Hampton Baptist Church. And we like answering questions or almost answering them, trying to give our best shot at some tricky things from the Bible and from life and about God. And today we've got another tricky one. I think in my life, in my experience. Greg, what's our question we're tackling today?
yeah, you're right. It is a tricky one, a tough one, and one that we probably won't get 100% right because this is really hard, right?
Yeah.
But the question is, what is a false teacher, and what do we do if we identify one?
Mm,
And so to nail down exactly what a false teacher is or who they are, and to be able to know exactly from scripture 100% of the time what we're to do, that is a difficult
that's a
difficult one to
difficult
work out.
line.
And and we have biases in there, right? There's certain people that we can naturally want to call a false teacher. We want to call them out.
Mm,
Um, and maybe they don't deserve that, right?
yeah.
Or maybe it's the other way around. They do deserve it, and we think, that's just them. We'll just
Yeah.
let them be, right? So it's a hard one to get right.
Now, I know from my experience, when I was in high school, this is when I think my brain started to work a little bit. And I started to realize that there were different
You're
opinions.
earlier than most people.
Oh, okay. Then maybe I could say I'm still working on getting the gears to turn. But I started to recognize, wait a second, people have different interpretations and different takes. And I think a mistake that I made when I was younger was, wait a second, I see a different take. I see a different interpretation. Wrong, incorrect, bad,
Yep.
evil. In
Mhm.
fact, I think sometimes was my experience thinking about um, different interpretations of the Bible. And I don't think that's fair all the time. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think I've been hasty to say that's wrong, that's bad, and you shouldn't involve yourself in that. I don't know, Greg. Like, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I think if you want to see how to do it wrong, just get on YouTube and do a search, right? Like, like
Heretic,
yes, like
evil.
people are labeled like, matter of fact, it's the way people get clicks, and it's the way they get views is by uh taking a famous person, uh usually a famous teacher or pastor or whatever, and just calling them out for being a heretic or being a false teacher, and that gets clicks and it gets people riled up, and it's actually very profitable.
Mm.
People make a lot of money off it, and
Greg,
so there's a lot of wrong ways that we can do this, and so we have to be really careful.
we seriously have to be careful.
Yeah,
This
and
is a
hopefully what we do today won't add to that YouTube
no,
noise that
unless I make the thumbnail of this video my face and then a heretic in giant
yes.
letters right underneath.
Point at some famous pastor, and that we
No, the
will
joke could
get
be that I'm the
lots.
heretic in the thumbnail.
Okay.
Say
That
if
might
you
not get quite as many clicks. People might not recognize your face yet,
no,
right?
no. If that's the thumbnail, you'll see it. You know that we've had this in the conversation, but it can be quite profitable. And
Yeah.
I know, is it true that we actually see in some of the New Testament like letters that like people were choosing certain leaders over others, Like they were saying,
Oh,
like, oh, you know what? This is my guy, but I won't listen to that other guy. Like,
yeah. Absolutely. Like First Corinthians is a big example of that, right? Um, Another interesting one that's very applicable to what we were just discussing is Philippians, where you have some teachers that were just out for gain and they were intentionally going against Paul, getting things riled up, and they were
mm,
making money off it, right?
yeah.
And that was happening way back there then before blogs and YouTube and all that stuff, right? So, so there's always going to be this noise out there with people pointing fingers and saying they're awful because they said this or they believe this instead of this. There's always going to be that noise out there. And here's just a simple little way to help us with that is look at who is making the noise.
Mm,
Is it a respected leader in the church, right? And what I mean by that is it somebody that is known for their years of faithfulness and contribution to the church in wide, right? Like the
right.
big picture church, not Hampton Baptist or whatever, but and what I'm talking about is major authors or teachers. Like if they're staying quiet, you probably should too,
Mm,
right? Like if I don't know, you name a teacher,
C.S. Lewis.
C.S. Lewis, okay? Name one that's alive.
Okay. Uh, Andy Stanley.
Okay, so let's say Andy Stanley goes off the deep end and gets all heretical, right?
Mm,
Do you know who's going to be the first ones to address that?
other
It's
large. Yeah.
exactly. Yep. And if they're saying nothing about Andy Stanley, you should be saying nothing about him too,
Right.
right? Because and that's a biblical thing. Like the church leaders are given the responsibility of oversight, and part
Mm,
of that is protecting. It's shepherding, right? And part of what a shepherd does is protect against the wolves. Like and so it is their responsibility, and in our context of Hampton Baptist, like it's our responsibility in the elders board to be looking out inside of our own church for these false teachings that creep in, and we should be the ones addressing it. And if there's ones on the outside that are having influence inside, then we need
mm.
to
We have
to
to
address
recognize
that.
that.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's our job. And so I don't want to put anybody on a pedestal or anything like that, but there is a structure to this given to us in the New Testament. And so the appropriate thing to do is if you're worried about is this a false teaching, is this a false teacher, is is talk to somebody who from a biblical perspective has the authority to look out for you, right?
Mm,
um that it's their job to make sure that you're kept safe and talk to them
yeah.
about it, right? And make sure that person first of all really is a false teacher, right? And
Mm,
then look at how do we address this. Is this a
mm,
local person, is this somebody online? Like it's very there's very many different ways it could be handled depending on who it is and where they are and their sphere of influence.
right. I do need to clarify, Andy Stanley, we are not calling you out. This is an example. We are not saying anything.
Yeah.
Will I use you
It,
for the thumbnail? I don't know. No, I'm kidding. I won't. No.
well, he's one that gets blasted often, right? And
Oh,
and
does
labeled
he?
a heretic. Oh yeah. And some of it is because he's willing to say publicly what people who study the Bible have known
For a long
forever.
time, right?
And sometimes sadly church leaders intentionally keep information from their congregations to
Mm.
try to
Like keep the status quo. Keep
yes
the mm,
and keep the answers very cookie cutter. Um,
mm,
and look, like God is way more complex, and his word is way more complex than our little simple answers. And so anybody who's willing to go into the complexities of things sometimes
Mm.
gets labeled just because they're saying things that people have never thought of before.
Like it's a little more nuanced.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I know, like, from my perspective, like when I was younger, I could look out and see, oh, that's a new thing that I haven't heard. And I think often we can be very, we can hold our little ideas and our opinions very close, and it can seem like an attack when somebody says something new, but
Yeah.
actually, the whole point of the church is that we're diverse and we have different abilities and ideas and things,
Yeah.
and we can all come together as one body. But
A-
I've
And
got a
so,
question after
yeah,
you
go
speak.
ahead.
But
No, you
oh
go
no,
ahead.
okay, cool. I was gonna ask a new question, and my new question was gonna be, um, what kind of false teachings would be the most prevalent?
Mhm.
I know in the early church there were some things that that popped up, and from my reading, from what I remember, like some of them also seem to pop up today again.
Yeah.
And I wonder, like, can we, like, I think we could look at some of the false teachings that they were getting sucked into to look at what we might be able, or what might be happening today.
For sure. Like one of, so I think we get a couple categories of false teaching. Um, One would be the the one that we typically think of is the actual quote unquote doctrine or theology or teaching something wrong, right?
Right.
Something intellectually wrong, right?
Mm,
Something that we hear and we think about when we process. Examples of that would be any teaching that Jesus isn't God in the flesh. That
mm,
like uh, in the early church, one of the prominent teachings was that Jesus didn't really have a human body, right? That
mm,
he didn't really, it was, he appeared like that, but
right.
right? And so John would make it very clear, no, that's not not the
We
way it
saw
is. And
him
that is,
die.
that's
We
right.
saw him bleed.
Yep. And that's actually a false teaching. The reason the author of Hebrews brings it out that Jesus had to have a human body
Mm,
because it's only in that human body he could one identify with us, but two actually pay the price that humans had earned. He had to
mm,
become a human to take our penalty upon himself that so that he could bleed, he could die, he could suffer in our place.
mm,
And so to take away from Jesus being 100% human, right? Well, that would be false teaching.
right.
Uh, on the flip side, to take away from him being 100% God.
Mm.
Um, think about it logically. God is an eternal being. How could God stop being God? Right?
Yeah.
Right?
It's not how it
It's not
works.
like, right. God the Son couldn't say, okay, I'm not going to be uh, God the Son anymore. I'm going to be this human son instead. No, he added to what he already was.
Mm,
He didn't stop being what he was. He added to what he already was, humanity. So he was completely God and completely human. Now, this is complex stuff, right?
this
This
is
is hard,
complex. Yeah.
right? Hard for us to grasp. But the way John puts it is a true believer is not going to deny these things.
Mm,
And the way I interpret that is we might not understand it fully, but we're not going to actively push against it.
right.
And so when you see somebody or a group or a church actively pushing against Jesus really being a human, for example, some would teach that he was an angel, right? A modern, what we would call a cult, um, that he wasn't God in the flesh. He was a created being for this purpose. All of like those things are false teachings, and we should be able to identify them and say, no,
Mm,
that's not Jesus, right? Like, give you a really simple example, Matt. Let's say I was to be talking to somebody and saying, yeah, I know this guy, Matt Hansen. Yeah, he's 6'9", he's blonde, and he's 300 pounds. Okay. Now
We
I'm
talking about the same Matt Hansen?
well, that's what the question becomes, right? Like,
Yeah.
and you're not going to take that description as a description of you,
No, of
right?
course not.
Right. So if we start saying, "Oh yeah, we put our faith in Jesus, but the Jesus that I trust in, right,
Mm,
is really an angel,
mm.
right? And he didn't really suffer and die on the cross. He just looked like he did, right? He just played a
Then what
part, right?
needed to be accomplished would not actually be accomplished,
Right.
and everything
And
kind
the
of unravels.
right, and the promises from the Old Testament are like God Himself would be our Savior, right? Like it's
Mm,
He wasn't creating some being to slaughter. Like
no,
the beauty of the story is that He loves us so much that He put Himself in harm's way,
that's right.
right? So so we can use the same label, the same name, Jesus, but be talking about a totally different
Mm,
uh, being, person entirely. And so it is important that we get the details correct, right?
right.
And and this is so significant because all religions really are human made.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
humans come up with the gods. They create the gods that supposedly created them, right?
yeah.
It's this weird thing, right? And we name them, we describe them, we label them, and then we
Mm,
worship them.
yeah.
That's how religion goes. Um, the true God of the Bible
He
named
labeled
himself.
himself. Yeah.
That's right. Like nobody gave him a name. He
No.
gave himself a name. He identified himself. He like just before he gave the Ten Commandments, he describes himself as the God who's full of loving kindness, loves to forgive sin. Like that's the
Mm,
very first description of God ever given, and he gives it himself about himself.
yeah. And
Um,
then he shows it.
that's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, so it's not okay for us to redefine God. Now, we might struggle with how he defined himself, and there's
Mm,
some freedom there. There's like we're going to get little things a little off, but we have to let God define himself
yeah.
and go with what he said, even if it goes against our
Like
um
our rationale
yeah,
of how does this work practically?
yeah,
How can we as humans understand an infinite God? Well, we
right.
can't. But I gotta I have a little question and answer link that the teens at youth group can go and submit questions. And one of the questions that was recently submitted was, "How can you explain the Trinity more clearly?" And so when I went to answer it, my answer was, to be able to understand it more clearly, you'd need to be able to understand God. And so we can't understand God, but I can we can understand what we don't understand.
Right.
So yeah, those little things are interesting. And I think those little doctrinal things, like I know like early like well, I'm gonna say late early church, like when things started to kind of become like a little bit of an entity. I feel like that was
Yeah.
the thing. People were calling out heresies. People were like, "This is we're trying to rationalize it now. We're trying to write it down." And I think it's still important that we know like what is it that we
Yeah.
believe, like just from like a doctrinal point. But what other kinds of false teachings can we like can slip up? Like I feel like there's
So,
things that's
so
not just about God's character, but
yeah, there's a definitely a bigger one, but what I'd like to say before we move in onto that bigger
of
one
course.
is when we look at the intellectual doctrine, the things that we are to understand with our brains and believe with our brains, right?
Mm,
Like that Jesus really was God, that he really did die, was buried, and rose again, right?
mm,
If you deny the resurrection, you are not a follower of Jesus. Like
yeah,
it's as simple as that. Like the resurrection is central to the story. Um, and so there there is um, definitely some things that we need to understand and we need to believe, but it's actually very little.
Mm.
like so much so that in the epistles, like so that we have one faith, in a sense, we have one doctrine.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's all this teaching of Jesus is
It's
what we call the
Jesus.
good news, the gospel, right?
Yeah.
And obviously there's some background to that that's important for us to understand and all that, but it's really very simple. And so many people who we would call heretics or that get labeled heretics, it's for a teaching on something that has nothing to do with Jesus,
Mm.
nothing to do with his deity, nothing to do with the resurrection, nothing to do with his return. Um, Maybe it's a disagreement on which books should be in the Bible, or a
Right.
disagreement on an interpretation of this or that or whatever, and they quickly get labeled as a heretic
Mm.
when
That's not
all they
actually the
have is a
case. It's
right. And here's where it gets really dangerous. Something I learned like years ago that's always stuck with me is in the New Testament, whenever it talks about doctrine singular,
it's
it's
talking
always
about
positive and it's about Christ, the
Jesus.
gospel,
Yeah.
right? Whenever it's doctrines plural, it's always connected with false teachers. And
Mm.
it's called doctrines of demons and things of that nature. Like that, it's always wrong when it's plural.
It's
And and
fascinating.
and the reason is if we take any teaching, even if it's a good one, right? Like let's talk about creation, or let's talk about inspiration of scripture, or let's talk
Right.
about the return of Jesus. Like, is it going to be before a judgment or after a judgment? What, like, we get all of that stuff. If we elevate any of those teachings up to the teaching of Jesus and his
We
death, burial, and resurrection and the new
we
life
got a
that we've
problem.
received from him, yeah, all of a sudden, even if it's a good thing
Yeah.
that we're talking about and excited about, if we start to elevate it, and so we're looking at people not based on, hey, are you a follower of Jesus? Right? But instead, are you a follower of Calvin?
Mm.
What do you believe about eternal security?
Right.
What do you believe about, right? And as soon as we take these other teachings and elevate them up to Jesus, they become false,
Yeah.
even if they're correct,
That's
right?
fascinating.
So
That's real. That's a really important line to draw.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And for people who don't draw that line correctly, then it becomes anybody who's off on any of these sub points become a
They're
heretic.
they cannot be saved.
That's right.
And that's not the truth.
No. So in the family of God, there's a lot of freedom in how we deal with a lot of issues, right?
Mm.
But there is complete unity in our
Mm.
understanding of Jesus and how we follow him and grow in him. Like those are the things that we're unified in. And the funny thing is, the more we focus on that, the more these other issues, they just kind of they
They
sit
just
in
kind
their
of they
place.
work, they just
Yes.
slip in.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
So once we have that side, like that intellectual side out of the way,
Which is
the
actually quite easy because it's
yes,
Jesus.
focus on Jesus, right?
Yeah.
And if you're really, really struggling with some area of teaching and understanding, like just read through the gospel accounts multiple times, like learn Jesus, right?
Because that's the
And
point.
right. And so many of the other questions start to fit into its context when we understand him.
Yeah.
Billy Graham used to read the Gospels. I forget if it was multiple times or at least once every day or something like that, just to keep his mind straight, right?
That's
And so
powerful.
yeah. Um, but when it comes to this other side of false teaching, it's actually maybe more dangerous, and we don't identify it quickly enough.
Mm.
And that is the false teaching of our actions.
Mm. Oh, this
And
is this is this is a very tricky one.
yeah, and here's where we I think some of our ignorance shows up a little bit, because when we think of teaching and becoming a disciple, we think of it, so much of it as a formal
You need to
understanding of.
learn these things. You need to have these things down pat. If someone says, all right, raise your hand and you'll get a piece of candy if you're able to. I don't
That's right. Yeah.
know.
That that's exactly it though, right? And
Yeah.
we think, well, if I go to Bible school or if I take these extra courses or if I we have a small group and then then I'm going to be a disciple and I'm going to know
Mm.
all the answers. And the answers are actually really simple. Like
But we
like
like to try to make it something larger.
right.
Yeah.
So what discipleship really is, the majority of it, yeah, it is learning the teaching of Jesus. There's no question about that. But the majority of it is what Jesus taught was for us to love the way he loved his disciples, right? The way
Mm.
he loves us. It's the living out of our faith.
Mm.
Like Paul said, like it's faith being expressed through love for other people. That's that's the true teaching, right? Because that's how we know we got it.
That's
That's how
right.
we know we not obviously that we've got Christ living inside of us and his spirit working in us, but also that we've understood the point of it all.
Mm.
Right? It's when we start living it out in tangible ways. And it's that living of our faith that is so powerful. And that's what we're being discipled in. The word
Mm.
disciple just means apprentice, right? Like for an apprentice, yeah, they've got some basic information, but they're on the job.
They
Like
are like they're working from the experience of it.
that's right. And
That's what
they're
Jesus did with his disciples. He told them, "All right, so you guys are going to go out and teach now, and you guys are going to go out and heal people." And they were like, "What?
yeah. Exactly.
Get going!"
Yep. And that's apprenticeship, right? Like that's what it is. And so what a teacher is primarily is an example.
Mm,
That's the big thing. Primarily, like you look at the qualifications for a leader in the church,
right.
and the majority of it is about example. It's like, how are they with their spouse? How are they with their
Mm,
kids? Right? Like, how are they in their community? How do they relate to their neighbor? Like those, you go through the qualifications. That's what it's talking about. And then, oh, they should be able to teach, right? Right?
yeah,
So they need to know some stuff and be able to communicate some stuff. But
they
the
have to live.
majority of it is how
Yeah.
they live it, right? Because that's what we're teaching.
Mm,
That's what we're
it's the
teaching is
example.
it, right. So the most dangerous false teacher is the one who knows the stuff about Jesus, knows the Bible inside and out, but lives something different.
Mm,
So they're critical in their speaking.
right.
They're they're vengeful. They're looking for ways to use their position to get back at other people. Like that's the most dangerous kind of false teaching. And usually that we don't even recognize,
Yeah,
right? Like the
because
passage before we got
it can be hidden very well.
right.
Yeah.
And that comes to the passage you mentioned before we kind of came on and recording here was where Jesus talked about by their fruits you'll know them, right?
Matthew chapter 7.
Do
Beware
you
of
have it there?
false. I do have
Yeah,
it.
good.
Matthew chapter 7, 15 to 20. Beware of false prophets who come disguised as harmless sheep, but are really vicious wolves. You can identify them by their fruit, that is, by the way they act. Can you pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? A good tree produces good fruit, and a bad tree produces bad fruit. A good tree can't produce bad fruit, and a bad tree can't produce good fruit. So every tree that does not produce good fruit is chopped down and thrown into the fire. Yes, just as you can identify a tree by its fruit, so you can identify people by their actions. That's the
Mhm.
NLT.
Yeah. So obviously he's not talking about fruit, right?
Obviously, he's not talking about fruit. No.
Right. And he makes it clear it's about our actions, and the place that I think our minds naturally should go is to the fruit of the spirit, right? Like
Mm,
the changes and the actions that God produces in us, and love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, self-control. Like these are things that God's spirit produces in us, and we can't produce ourselves. We can't
no.
fake it,
No.
right? And so when we see people that, yeah, they believe the right things about Jesus, yes, but more importantly, the evidence of Jesus' salvation and spirit is being lived out in their life. None of us live it perfectly, right?
Mm,
But there should be evidence of this love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, self-control. And it has nothing to do with somebody's giftedness.
mm,
Like somebody can be an unbelievably good speaker or teacher or administrator or whatever and be a complete false teacher because the Spirit of God is not actually changing that individual's life, right?
yeah.
So I'm not even saying that that person might not be saved or right with God. I'm not going there. I'm just saying they shouldn't be teaching and they shouldn't be followed
Mm,
because what will, whenever you have somebody in a leadership position, what gets passed on is always attitudes and behaviors.
yeah.
The mindsets, they get changed easily. We're flippant with that, right?
Yeah.
But our behaviors and our attitudes and all of that trickles down, and
That's dangerous.
absolutely. And so that's why it's so important that when people are in leadership in the church, that there's a real consistent growth and godliness there.
Yeah. That would take a lot of well, you'd need a lot of people to be checking up on you and like working with you and saying, I don't know, Greg, you did this, and or I don't know, Matt, you did this, and I don't know if that shows the best example. And I think we should
Right.
be able to have those kinds of conversations.
Absolutely. And that's the kind of accountability that we're supposed to have with each other,
That's
right?
right.
And oftentimes in our individualistic society, we don't go that
No,
route, right?
because it can look like an attack. It can look
Yeah.
like you have a different opinion and this is bad. And so I feel like that's like how do we go about those situations, right? and
Mm.
and it we this I think is the trickiest maybe part of this conversation is say we identify this, say we identify someone who they know all the things and they could even have giftedness, but the way that they treat people is poor, or like you can just tell that this person is they're not doing it for Christ. They're not doing it for Jesus. But like I don't even know if that's the right language to use around
Yep.
it, but what do we do?
Yeah. So again, this, like the rest of this topic, this is extremely easy to get wrong.
Yeah.
Let's just put it in real life context, okay? So let's say you and I are in kind of a leadership position. So
Yeah.
let's say there's somebody in the church that rubs me the wrong way, right?
Mm,
And I don't like how they're handling this or that or
this
what they've
thing.
said about me or whatever, right? It's awful easy to try to turn people against that individual. And the
Yeah.
reality is maybe they are even in the wrong
Mm,
somewhere, but so are we all, right?
yeah,
And it takes a while for us to grow, right?
it does.
And so instead of maybe going to that person in private and having a conversation like the way Jesus instructed,
That's right.
right? Then maybe I could, talk to some other people behind that person's back and make sure they don't get areas of service in the church and stuff like that. And it's very easy to manipulate situations and really minimize people because I don't like one part of them, right?
Mm.
But on the flip side, there's a real danger of, if there is an obvious area of spiritual lacking in an individual's life, even though they are gifted, but everywhere they go, they bring dissension and division,
Mm.
hostility. And if we as leaders allow that to go on unchecked,
It will
then
happen. Things
it
will
will.
be divided. Things
And
will, yeah.
it's on us. We're responsible for it. So there's this. That's why, again, following God's spirit, following His leading, being humble, uh,
Mm.
seeking God's direction, maybe asking people who are smarter than us, or the getting counsel from others. Like, it's very important that we handle things like this very carefully, because it's so easy to go to one extreme or the other. Either we don't even look at false teaching at all and pretend like it doesn't exist,
Mm.
or we start labeling people
False
all over the
teacher,
place.
really easy,
Yes,
like just taking the red stamp.
that's right. And I've seen both of those in my little life, right?
Yeah.
And it's both can be very, very destructive. Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of discernment that would have to
Mm,
go through that. And you mentioned like one, like if we're gonna take an action, you highlighted Jesus's instruction to, if there's someone who sins against you, go to them privately and like
yeah.
try to work it out. And that format of like go and have a conversation with the individual and not start spreading that dissension and hatred yourself, because then
Because that
you
is
are,
false teaching.
yeah, then you are
Yes.
being a false teacher.
Right.
So that's a very tricky line.
Hmm. Yeah. So we haven't given a lot of answers, I guess,
Well,
but
almost answers.
right. But I think I think a couple really important keys is to just have a good understanding of Jesus, right?
Yeah.
And then if somebody's off in their understanding of who God is, who Jesus is, what God did for us through Jesus, right? If they're off in those areas, then I think it is fair to say they're just off, right? That they
Mm,
are a false teacher. But most of the ones that get the clicks on YouTube, right, um, are not in that category, right?
right.
I might disagree with them, maybe even strongly, but
Mm,
right. Um, so yeah, making sure we have a good understanding of Jesus, and making sure that we are following people who are following Jesus' example in their living.
that's right.
And that's like Paul, this is something we get, I think, really, really wrong. When we think of going and making disciples,
Mm,
we think make disciples of Jesus, right? That's not what Jesus said. And it's not what he
mm,
meant. And it's not how the disciples understood it. Jesus was saying, I made disciples of you. You go make disciples of yourselves,
but
right?
for me, yeah,
Exactly. So Paul said this very clearly. He said, "Be be followers of me
as I
as
follow
I follow Christ."
Christ. Yeah.
Right? That is our job as believers, to be following others that are following others that are following others that are following Christ. That's the
Mm,
pattern. And so we have to make sure that we're following ones that are actually following Jesus. And again, none of us do it perfectly,
mm,
but you can tell. Like, you be around somebody for long enough, and you can tell when there's sincerity there,
yeah.
right? And when there's growth there and all of that, and when God's spirit is present, and when it is not, right?
Right.
So super important
Really
is that,
important.
yeah,
You look
that.
at the actions.
So what do you do if there's somebody in our church, Matt, that's just their life and their teaching just doesn't line up?
Well, Jesus died for this person too. And so it would be wrong of me to try to, what if I create a perfect little situation so that nobody likes him and then they leave? No,
Mm.
then I am being a false teacher. Um, I'd go and I'd have a conversation with them, trying to, um, I don't know. I think that we can point out, hey, so I've seen you act this way, and this isn't how Jesus would have you act. Um, and I think that's how we should come at it. Like I don't even think you could go to someone and say, "Hey, so you've got it all wrong." But I think by like maybe even go with some scripture, like, "Hey, so this is how we're told to act," um, and I've seen you do some things that aren't like this, and I wanted to bring this to your attention. Like, I don't know. Like, what do you think, Greg?
Yeah.
Is that it?
Yeah, there's a couple examples, like for example, Philippians 4, where Paul calls out some ladies that weren't getting along and gives them some direct instruction. So I think there's a place for even that.
Yeah.
Galatians 6, is it, where talks about like he is spiritual, going like basically that idea of bearing each other's burdens, like
Mm,
help each other out. Be careful you don't fall into the same sin, but we need to help
yeah.
each other. And I think
Yeah.
that attitude in going to people, um,
Like I'm here to help. I want to help with
that's right.
this. I'm not trying
Like,
to like blot you out. I'm trying, like, I know, like, us as humans, we we mess up. We struggle
yeah,
with sin. There's a war that goes on inside of us. And that's what we're trying to address, not the
right,
individual, because
right,
we are Jesus died so we could be unified, not so that we could kick people out of our little club because they're not doing the same things as we are.
right. Yeah. So I think those type of actions are the priorities. There is clear instruction when it becomes very obvious. And I think this should not just be obvious in your own mind. I think it should be obvious in the mind of the leadership of maybe the church that you're at, or and I'm not trying to put leadership on a pedestal, but if things are functioning properly, the ones that should be there should have gifts of discernment,
Mm,
should like they should be in those positions because God has put them there intentionally to protect,
right.
right? And so I'm not saying leadership will get it right 100% of the time, but I think going to the leadership and getting their perspective is very important
Mm.
on some of this. Um,
Like, especially if you're going to have a conversation, like, you should probably check yourself to make sure that you're going with the right intention first. So yeah, talking to
right.
the church leadership would be so important, because I wouldn't want
Mhm.
to foolishly go to someone thinking that I'm going to make this right, and then I realize that I have a wrong perspective.
Right. Um, and once there is an identification that, yeah, there's something really wrong, whether it's somebody in our own congregation or somebody who's on the outside who's harassing us, right? Like maybe
Mm,
it's books they've written, or maybe it's a church down the street or whatever. Like in those cases, um, Paul does give us some pretty good instruction, as well as Jesus. Like basically, we're to stay away from people like that, right?
yeah.
That's kind of the standard answer in the New Testament is just make sure you don't get sucked into it. Um, let the leadership in the early church case, it was like Paul and Peter and others. Let let them call out if there somebody needs to be called out, but you stay
Mm,
away from it. You
right.
don't get sucked into it, right? Um, that's that's the important part. So what do you do if you see somebody getting sucked into it, right?
Yeah, like do you tell them, like, hey man, so we don't we've seen the character of this person before, and maybe that's what you
Yeah.
do. Maybe you tell them, like, we have seen some character from that person, and we want, of course, you make your own judgments and discern, but this is what we've seen, and we would we feel we'd be doing you a disservice if we did not tell you about this.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes those challenging conversations need to happen. Lots of prayer needs
Lot
to
of
happen,
prayer,
right?
maybe more prayer than
Yeah.
figuring out what you're going to say in the conversation.
Right. Because here's why it's so dangerous. The One of the common traits of false teachers is that they are divisive.
Mm,
Like if you look in the New Testament, that is the repeated theme that comes up over and over with false teachers. And the way they're divisive is they want trust and respect to come towards them
mm,
and less towards Jesus and other people in the church, right? So there's always this like draw towards themselves, right?
mm,
So as people are getting sucked into the false teaching, whether it's locally inside of our own congregation or on a bigger scale, when when people are getting sucked in, they're getting sucked into that person. So they are now trusting that person more than any other teacher, any other leader, any other
right.
voice in their life. So if you go to them and say, that person that you're trusting, right, that you're following is
Yeah.
actually a false teacher, it probably won't go well,
No.
right? They are going to turn on you
Yeah.
and they will be angry,
Yeah.
right? So I'm not saying you don't have that conversation. I'm just saying there needs to be a lot of prayer, probably a lot of relationship, a lot of stuff going on to pull that person back.
That's
It's
right.
really difficult.
Really difficult.
And sometimes sadly it's only when they see for themselves
The
the
cracks in
yeah,
the persona when the
that
wolf mask slips.
that's right.
Yeah.
That they all of a sudden get freaked out and pull back.
Yeah. And I think spending enough time with anyone, you will see it. And
Hmm.
so I think, I don't know, I feel like a lot of leaders who would be compromised like that, perhaps the congregation would just die at some point or have such a high turnover that there's not a real sustainability. But yeah, that's really tricky.
Yeah, and there's always going to be falseness out there, right?
Mm, that's the
What I
world.
think
That's the way it
that's right.
goes. Yeah.
So what is most important for us is to make sure that that falseness doesn't get in
Creep into
here,
here.
like in
Yeah.
who what if you're watching this of whatever local church you're involved in, and I hope you are involved with one, right? It's to make sure that there's a faithfulness in you and a faithfulness in that church in lifting up Jesus,
Ah, that's huge.
that he's the one that matters most, the resurrection, the changed life that his spirit brings. Like those are the main things. Everything else falls in line behind, and to make sure that there's a s- a way of living
Mm,
in that church family that reflects Jesus and shows that we're moving in the direction of Christ likeness, right?
that's
So,
huge.
so if those things are there, you're in a good spot, right?
Yeah. Greg, we talked about so much today.
Yeah.
This will be a longer episode with me and my face. I'm a heretic all along. I don't know. Matt, it's him. No. But yeah, a lot of really important things to think about. And in any of those situations, prayer is so
Mhm.
pivotal. Like even if you recognize, like, hey, this person's rubbing me the wrong way, pray and ask God, this person's rubbing me the wrong way, and I don't know what to do. I want to best reflect Jesus, and help me, give me this the strength, the ability to do that, because I can't do it on my own. And yeah, let's rely on Jesus, because I think that when we rely on him, he he does work. um so yeah, If you've made it to the end, thank you so much for watching. If you want to hear more gripping discussions like this, subscribe to our channel here. And if you like actually want to like talk to us and contact us, we've got a Facebook page for our church. And if you want to come to our church, I will shake your hand and I will say, hello, I'm Matt. It's good to meet you. But thank you so much for watching this episode of Questions and Almost Answers. And we're excited for the next one. Submit your questions, and we will see you in the next one. Goodbye, everyone.